Chapter 1, Unwanted Arrival. I like to say I arrived before anyone had time to clear a space for me. The year doesn't really matter. What matters is that my mother was 16, the kind of pretty that made people talk, and the kind of poor that made people bold with their judgments. Her name was written on school attendance sheets and youth group rosters, not on mortgage papers or marriage licenses. She still needed a parent's signature for certain things, but there she was in a hospital gown, about to sign mine. No one had planned for me. Not really. My existence slipped between the cracks of caution and consequence, somewhere between a teenage girl's lonely need to feel wanted and a young soldier's hunger to escape a small town before it swallowed him whole. His name was Daniel, my father, the man whose shadow I would grow up chasing. The story of my beginning was handed to me like a family heirloom, wrapped in half-truths, softened in some places, left razor-sharp in others. My mother met him at a party she wasn't supposed to attend, surrounded by loud music, cheap liquor, and the sweet, stale smell of other people's bad decisions. He was in uniform, and in a town like ours, that was all it took for a boy to become a hero. He wore the army-like armor, fresh haircut, straight shoulders, dog tags that clinked softly like punctuation when he laughed. To a 16-year-old girl still trying to figure out where she ended and the world began, he looked like a way out of the town, of the rumors, of the small life everyone seemed to have already written for her. They didn't talk about forever. They probably didn't even talk about next week. There was a night, a moment, bodies pressed together in a way that felt like love to a girl who hadn't really learned the difference between desire and devotion. It was messy, imperfect, and thoughtless, like most teenage choices. And somewhere in that tangle, I sparked into being. By the time she missed her second period, he was gone. Orders, deployment, transfer. Whatever word they used, it added up to the same thing. He left. The bus pulled away, the base swallowed him, and his life marched forward in desert boots, while mine silently began, a cluster of dividing cells inside, a girl who could barely carry her own pain, much less another heartbeat. My mother found out in a bathroom, of course. That's how these stories always seem to start. A cramped space, a faded shower curtain, a sink stained by hard water and harder living. She stared down at a plastic stick with two pink lines, tiny, merciless proof that something had happened she couldn't take back. At 16, pregnancy isn't a glow, it's a siren. She tried to reach him, she told me, tried to get a message through to his base, tried to get someone to care enough to connect the scared teenage girl to the soldier who left his fingerprints and his last name all over her insides. But the Army has its own priorities, and small-town girls with shaking voices don't top the list. Months passed. Her belly grew. Her world shrank. The whispers came first, then the looks, then the sermons wrapped in concern but dripping with shame. Words like fast and ruined floated behind her like a bad smell. She went from being that pretty little thing to that pregnant girl in record time. The night I came, the hospital lights buzzed overhead like fluorescent judgment. She was still so little, petite, baby-faced, her body caught right at that edge between child and woman, now forced to open wider than her life had prepared her for. The room was cold and bright, the air sharp with antiseptic and anxiety. Her mother, my grandmother, stood nearby, arms folded, eyes hard. Not because she felt nothing, but because she'd already learned what it took my mother years to understand. Life doesn't gentleness you into responsibility. It shoves you. Push, the nurse said. I can't, my mother cried. You have to. And out of that have to, I came. There was blood, too much for a girl. There was tearing, the kind they stitched in layers, each tug a reminder that some pains are earned by choices and some are simply the cost of carrying life. But then there was me, red, slick, outrage, lungs punching sound into the room, like I'd already figured out that silence never saved anybody. She's got some lungs on her, a nurse said, half laughing. They put me on my mother's chest, a tiny stranger sinking into the skin of a girl who hadn't even finished growing. For a moment, the room quieted. Shame stepped back. Fear loosened. It was just the two of us, breathing in the same strange air. I didn't plan you, she would admit years later, with a guilty little laugh that never quite reached her eyes. You were a surprise. Unplanned. That's one of those words people use when they're trying not to say mistake. Somewhere, while my mother was sweating and screaming, Daniel was standing in a different kind of room entirely, a place that smelled like starch and metal and disinfectant. No blood, no newborn cries, just the rustle of uniforms and the heavy beat of boots on tile. A man in a higher rank, or maybe a clerk with bored eyes, handed him an official envelope. Government paper, government ink, his name typed neatly at the top. He opened it. Inside there was no photograph, no little inked footprints, no soft handwritten note telling him about the way my fingers curled or how my hair was damp and dark against my mother's chest. Just a telegram. PFC Daniel, blank, you are listed as father on birth certificate of female child. Name, Marie. Born, date, mother, her name. No punctuation of joy, no congratulations, just the cold architecture of fact. My entire existence, flattened to a handful of lines. He learned I was real not from my cry, not from holding me, not from looking into a face that might have carried his nose or his eyes. He learned about me from a machine-type message, delivered hours or days after my first breath, reducing the chaos and miracle of birth to a brief notification. You have a child. I picture him reading that sentence over and over. You have a child. The words must have landed in his chest like a stone. Maybe his stomach dropped. Maybe his mouth went dry. Maybe he laughed it off with his buddies. Maybe he stared at that page alone that night, haunted by the idea of a tiny person bearing his last name. Because that was the part that stuck with me when my mother finally told me he was listed, Daniel. My father was right there on my birth certificate, his name in ink above mine. I carried his last name, stamped onto my identity like a promise he never showed up to keep. On paper, I belonged to him as much as to her. That document said, clearly and forever, that I was not a question mark. I was not a rumor. I was not just that girl's baby. I was his daughter. On paper. In reality, he folded that truth away. The story goes that he slipped the telegram back into its envelope, then folded the whole thing in quarters, pressed the crease with his thumb until the paper softened. Maybe he shoved it into a drawer. Maybe he buried it in the bottom of his duffel bag. Maybe he threw it out with mess hall trash, letting it land beside empty cans and used napkins. What I know is what came next. Nothing. No phone call to the hospital. No flowers. No letter to my mother. No request for a photo. No trembling, shaky voice confession to his commanding officer that he'd made a baby back home and didn't know what to do. He knew my name. He knew my gender. He knew the date I crashed into the world. He knew my mother's name. He knew I existed. And still, he disappeared. So while my mother was being walked carefully to the bathroom for the first time, bleeding and dizzy, trying to lower herself onto the toilet without crying, he was walking away from the only chance he had to be my father. While a nurse showed my grandmother how to support my head properly, he was figuring out how not to support anything at all. He left, and the only evidence that he was ever there in the first place was my face and a line of text on a government form, Marie Blank. My first and middle names belonged to my mother. My last name belonged to a man I never met, a man who knew and still chose absence. That's an important difference. It's one thing to be abandoned by someone who never knew you existed. It's another to be abandoned by someone who read your whole life reduced to a few words and still said, in his own way, no. I was unwanted out loud by no one, but unwanted in action by him. My mother took me home from the hospital with stitches still burning and nipples cracked from my hungry latch. She held me in the crook of her arm like both a blessing and a sentence. People came by to see us. They brought pastel blankets, tiny socks, cheap stuffed animals. They cooed, "She's so precious." And then, when they thought my mother couldn't hear, they asked, "So, where's the daddy?" "The army," someone would say. Or, "He's away right now." Or, "He's not in the picture." But he was in the picture, inked into the corner of my life like a signature on a painting he refused to claim. I grew up knowing his last name wasn't a mystery. It was right there in my earliest identity. The letters in my full name forming a bridge to a man who wouldn't cross it. My birth certificate didn't lie. It told the story as it should have been. Mother and father, both present, both marked as mine. Reality told a different one. A teenage girl carrying a child she didn't plan, and a young soldier who learned about that child from a telegram and chose to vanish anyway. That telegram was my first piece of proof and my first wound. Proof that I wasn't made up, that I wasn't some accident of assumption. The government knew I existed. The army knew I existed. Daniel knew I existed. The ink on that paper testified that I was real enough to be notified about. Wound, because the same paper marked the moment he consciously stepped away. The weight of that decision would settle later into the corners of my life like silt at the bottom of a cup. My life from the beginning was like tea brewed in water that started off dirty. The bitterness didn't come from me. It came from what surrounded me, from the shame that clung to my mother, from the silence that wrapped itself around his name, from the fact that my very first official document carried both the promise of belonging and the reality of abandonment. Unplanned, written down anyway, named but not held. I took my first breaths under the fluorescent glare of a hospital that saw teenage mothers too often. I went home, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like laundry detergent, tucked into the arms of a girl trying to become a woman overnight. Somewhere far away, my father folded a telegram that said I was here and chose not to come looking. That's how my story begins. With my mother's shaking signature on a birth certificate, my father's name typed neatly beside mine, and the empty space he left growing wider with every day he did not appear.